So now we're going to turn to an exploration of the actual problem that we're trying to solve in making a decision. And you might remember back to our 8-step model of how we make decisions. And the very first part of that was identifying what the problem was. So we're going to start to dig into this a little bit. And so generally speaking, we can think of problems as falling into one of two categories. We have structured problems, which are ones that are fairly straightforward, and ones that we can easily define and we might have some familiarity with. And then unstructured problems are more ones that are ambiguous, or that perhaps we haven't encountered before, or that crop up from time to time, or where we might have incomplete information as well. And as we go through this, I'm going to give some examples from my time running events and festivals to illustrate some of these concepts. So for example, when I used to run a lot of conferences, and a typical structured problem we would encounter is what should we choose for the catering? And so we would know, the venue would have a menu of different options that we could choose from. We would know how many people we had. We would have a certain budget attached to the catering that we would give, that we would assign for each participant. And then it was a fairly routine matter to go through and just choose from the menu and look for a pretty good balance over the number of days of the festival. An example of an unstructured problem might be something like, who should we have as the keynote speakers? And that involved a more complex decision-making process because, it wasn't straightforward. We needed to kind of balance out, well, who's got something particularly interesting to say in this space at the moment, who might be a bit of a draw card, who's potentially got a name, and so they would attract participants, etc., etc., etc. And so that would be an example of an unstructured problem where we don't actually have a really easy option and we've got to really think it through. And then in terms of decision making, we also have the idea of programmed and non-programmed decisions. So programmed decisions are one that we would do more routinely and sort of repetitively. So this would be, for example, if you owned a cafe, a repetitive decision might be something like, how many staff do we need on each day to run the cafe? And you might need to make different decisions based on different parameters week to week. So for example, if your trading goes up over the summer, then you're going to need to put on more people, and you're going to need to be across that as a manager that, all right, yep, the weather's warming up, so we're going to need to increase the number of staff we've got in our cafe. And then in winter, you might reduce it. And you might also have different parameters like who's available and et cetera, and you've got to manage all these things. But generally speaking, you can make those decisions in a fairly routine way. And then non-programmed decisions are ones that we need to make our own custom-made solution. Yep. So again, thinking back to my events time, like a program decision might be, in terms of the actual conference program, a programmed element of that might be things like the actual running schedule. We would normally open the, say, registration desk at 8, we would kick off the conference at 9, we'd stop for morning tea at 10:30 or whatever, etc., etc. And so there would be a fairly, from event to event, there would be a general set of programmed principles that we would use to establish the overall schedule of the conference. But then depending on how many people, say, were interested in speaking, what kinds of talks they were doing, whether it was a workshop or a keynote or whatever, and who they were, within that overall schedule, we might have to make a lot of non-programmed decisions. So around who was going to speak against who. This often happens in festivals where you've got 2 stages, say, and you've got to decide, all right, which bands are we going to run concurrently? And you've got to work that out based in the actual parameters of who you've got to work with. Yeah, so the slots might be a programmed decision, but who is in those slots might be a non-programmed type decision. And then when we think about programmed decision making, we've got these three concepts that we can think of that can help us make decisions at different levels. So a rule, you know, I think we're all familiar with what the idea of a rule is, and this is a very explicit statement that says what you can and cannot do. So an example from my background might be something like liquor licensing rules, where, you know, we would be given rules from the liquor licensing department that then we were responsible for implementing as they were. So, you know, we had a rule that we had to check ID because of the requirement on us that we didn't sell booze to underage kids. So we had a very explicit rule that said you cannot sell alcohol to underage. And so as a result, we had a rule you had to check ID. A policy is a more sort of general set of guidelines or advice that actually helps you start to think about the parameters around how you make a good decision. So an example of this might be if you are running a festival and you want to have you might have a green policy, so that's about it being an environmentally friendly policy. And so as part of that policy, you might set up that, you know, wherever possible, we will use environmentally sustainable materials. And so then when it comes to the decision around, well, what cups are we going to buy for our bar? Based on that policy, you might decide, okay, well, instead of buying plastic cups, we're going to buy disposable, biodegradable cups that are more environmentally friendly than plastic cups. And that goes back to this general policy that has helped you have that general guideline on making that decision that says we want to, wherever possible, use environmentally friendly materials. And then a procedure, sure as the name suggests to you, is a set of steps that you can follow that will help you manage a decision well. So an example from my background is, you know, when we used to run festivals, outdoor festivals, we would have food vendors come in. And so once they said they wanted to be one of our food vendors, we had a series of steps we would go through. So for example, we would check that they had their safe food handling license from the council. If they wanted to sell alcohol, they needed to have their own liquor license. We needed to find out if they needed power, and if they needed power, did they just need regular 240 or 3-phase? Did they have anything that was a particular fire hazard, such as a deep fryer? Did they need access to a sink and water, etc., etc., etc.? And so we had steps and procedures that helped us kind of work through those decisions around, all right, if they need 3-phase power, then we will do this. If they don't need 3-phase power, we don't need it. So we move on to the next step. And so generally speaking, and we looked at this a little bit in our first chapter around the complexity and the level of responsibility that sits with how high up you are in an organization in terms of your managerial level. And we've got a diagram here that sort of maps out for us, generally speaking, the ratio of programmed to non-programmed decisions and the level of structured or unstructured problems you're likely to be dealing with as a consequence of sort of how high up you are in the organization. And so as you can see, generally speaking, the lower level of manager you are, the more time you would expect to find yourself making programmed decisions as opposed to non-programmed decisions. So for example, again, if you're running a festival, you know, you might have a bar manager, and that bar manager's job might be to do things like rostering, ordering. You know, they might need to work out, okay, how many kegs of beer are we going to need, how many, etc., etc., etc. And those decisions will be fairly structured because it'll be calculated based on the number of punters that are expected and, you know, the experience around what kinds of things people would drink. And then the rostering would be based again around how many people are expected, etc. And then they'll have some non-programmed decisions, like, for example, you know, maybe they'll place an order and then on the day the order arrives and there's something missing. And so then they've got to try and make a decision around, what do I do now in order to fulfill this missing requirement. In contrast, if you're the CEO or the sort of manager, or the top manager or the owner of that festival, chances are you're going to be dealing with a lot more non-program decisions than program decisions. So you're going to be dealing with a lot of complexity, and you're going to be facing a lot of problems that there's no clear and obvious solution to. So you're going to have to be just working through them on a sort of day-to-day basis, and also setting the overall strategy and direction of the organisation, which is something that is also much more complex and is non-programmed. So it's about, well, where do we want to go, and how might we get there, rather than, okay, these are the steps we're going to actually do on the basis of what we've decided. And so corresponding to all of this is that, based on the level of structured or unstructured, the level of complexity attached to those different types of decisions that you're going to be facing, we face different levels of certainty, uncertainty, and risk, which I guess is fairly obvious, but it just means that the more certainty you can attach to a decision, the more accurate your predictions are going to be about that situation. Yeah. So the more you can reduce the uncertainty in the decisions that you make, you're going to lower your risk, but you're also going to be able to make more programmed decisions. So an example of that, I remember my friend who was the owner of the Brisbane Livid Festival, he told me once, so Livid Festival is usually in October in Brisbane. And I remember him telling me that the reason he made the decision about when it was, both in terms of the month, so he had actually gotten the rainfall records for Brisbane for, I think, 100 years. And he had looked at when was the lowest rainfall weekend historically in the Brisbane area. And so it was in October, around mid-October, say. And so he had made the decision about when to host the festival. And then year to year, he would actually get even more nuanced and narrow and actually try and work out which Saturday was going to be the best day to host the festival because of the historical rainfall records. And that was about trying to reduce the level of uncertainty around inclement weather. You know, so he could have just thrown a dartboard or worked it out based on when there was the least on in Brisbane to compete with his festival. But he decided that rainfall was probably going to be the biggest challenge to his festival being a success. And so he wanted to really try and manage the uncertainty that was attached to that.